Welcome to the Providence College Podcast. My name is Joe Carr. We're changing it up a little this time around, presenting an episode of Beyond Your Newsfeed, Understanding Contemporary Politics. New this fall, Beyond Your Newsfeed is the brainchild of Dr. Bill Hudson, chair of the Providence College Political Science Department. He also serves as the host, interviewing his faculty colleagues. This interview features Dr. Tony Affigne, and the subject is Latino and Latina candidates and voters, discussed mostly in the context of the November 6th midterm election. Beyond Your Newsfeed is available in iTunes and all the other places where you can find podcasts.
Welcome to Beyond Your Newsfeed, Understanding Contemporary Politics, a podcast of the Political Science Department of Providence College. My name is William Hudson. I'm chair of the Political Science Department at PC and host of this podcast. Any opinions expressed on this podcast are my own or those of my guest. We're continuing our analysis of the upcoming midterm elections today, and we want to take a look at one group of voters, Latino voters, who are likely to have a significant impact on this midterm election. We've seen that there are a number of new Latina candidates who have made a splash in the news. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Julia Salazar in New York defeated some establishment Democrats in primaries over the summer. We also know that Latino voters are likely to be and have an important impact on the races in a number of states, such as Florida and Texas. And President Trump's anti-immigrant actions and rhetoric are widely believed to be of special concern to Latin voters and potentially will mobilize them to turn out in this election. To get some perspective on the impact of Latinos on the upcoming election and in more general ways that Latino citizens are shaping American politics, I have asked a leading expert on Latino politics in the United States, my colleague Tony Affigne, to join us. Professor Affigne is a graduate of Brown University, where he also earned his PhD. He has been a member of the Providence College faculty since 1991 and has served as department chair and as founding director of the Black Studies program. Tony has published widely on Latino politics, including his book, Latino Politics in Ciencia Politica, The Search for Latino Identity and Racial Consciousness. He currently serves as book review editor for the Journal of Race, Ethnicity, and Politics. In addition to his scholarship, Dr. Affigne has been a major voice within the political science discipline, promoting the study of the politics of race and ethnicity, including Latino politics, and the cultivation of young minority scholars through his service on the board of the American Political Science Association, as co-founder of its section on race, ethnicity, and politics, and the Latino Caucus. The association recognized Tony's contributions in these areas in 2011 by awarding him the Frank J. Goodenow Award for Distinguished Service to the Profession. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over many of Tony's other accomplishments, particularly his many contributions to local government and politics in Rhode Island. I will add, however, that Tony's courses at PC, such as Race and Politics in the Americas and Environmental Politics, are among the most popular and sought after among our students. Tony, thanks for joining us today on Beyond Your Newsfeed.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Bill.
So to begin, Tony, can you enlighten us a little bit about this label, Latino? Exactly who are we talking about when we talk about Latinos in the United States?
Latino is a label used to describe people living in the United States who are themselves immigrants from or are the descendants of immigrants from the former Spanish colonies in the Americas. Generally speaking, the largest of the Latino populations are Mexican Americans. Most Mexican Americans are either 20th century immigrants or the children or grandchildren of immigrants from Mexico, but a significant number are also descended from people who lived in what is now the southwestern region of the United States, from Texas all the way over to California, when that part of the country was conquered in the Mexican-American War. So among Mexican Americans, we have both families who have been here for several hundred years, and also families who have arrived more recently in the 20th and 21st century. The second largest group of Latinos, numbering about 5.6 million, are Puerto Ricans, also who became part of the United States after the Spanish-American War in 1898, when Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines were conquered by the United States after that war. So we have the Mexican-American population today numbers about 36.7 million. The Puerto Rican population about 5.6. The third largest group are Cuban Americans, many of whom are refugees from Cuba after 1959 and their descendants. And the newest and most rapidly growing group among the four largest are people from the Dominican Republic, about 2.1 million people from the Dominican Republic, about 2.3 million from Cuba. We also have large populations from El Salvador, about 2.3 million, Guatemala, about 1.5 million, and Colombia, about 1.2 million. So when we talk about Latinos today, we're talking about the roughly 59 million Americans who can trace their ancestry to one of those former colonies of the Spanish Empire.
So, Tony, this sounds like quite a diverse group, actually, with different national origins, different periods of time when they came to this country. How strong is this identity of Latino among these people, or to what extent might someone identify as a Mexican American or a Cuban American rather than a Latino?
Well, that's one of the core questions of Latino political studies, because there are some differences among groups historically. The experiences which led people to come to the United States are quite different. Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans can both trace their existence as U.S. citizens to war when the U.S. conquered northern Mexico, the northern half of Mexico in 1848, and Puerto Rico and Cuba, 1890s. But there's also a lot that links Latinos together, even if they come to the U.S. or their ancestors came to the U.S. for different reasons. Latinos tend overwhelmingly to be working class Americans. They tend to share similar experiences of discrimination in education, employment, housing, and so on. The Latino poverty rate in 2016 was about 20%, whereas the non-Hispanic white poverty rate in the U.S. is only about 9%. African Americans' poverty rate's about 22%. So Latinos, wherever they're from, tend to share the experience of poverty, and for that reason, although Latinos are increasingly moving into the professions and the arts and politics, the political center of gravity for the Latino population remains those core issues of income inequality, education, healthcare, and so on. So while there are factors, historical factors and cultural factors which make the Latino population very diverse, there are also social and economic factors which tend to give them similar views in politics and make possible alliance building across ethno-national origin.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like as a group that's predominantly working class, they also will share a lot of concerns with African Americans and working class white Americans as well. So there's possibility of coalition building even outside of the Latino community with these other groups.
Exactly.
So in terms of politics, what can we say about Latinos and their political participation? I think the general assumption of many commentators is that Latinos are predominantly supportive of the Democratic Party. To what extent is that true, or to what extent are there differences among Latinos in terms of their partisan identification?
That is true, that Latinos tend to be Democrats. In the presidential election of 2016, less than 1 in 5 Latinos voted for President Trump. The vast majority of Latinos, almost 80% and almost 90% in some states, voted for the Democratic candidate. There is some difference in ethno-national terms, Cuban Americans who are historically have been concentrated in South Florida tended to be Republicans, whereas Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans tended to be overwhelmingly Democratic. That's still the case, and it's still true that the partisan identification of Latinos varies regionally, from state to state, from region to region. But increasingly, because of the very bitter attacks on Latinos generally and immigrant Latinos in particular that have emanated from the Republican Party in the last 10 or 12 years, increasingly the Latino population is identifying with the Democratic Party. In Colorado in 2012, for instance, when Obama was on the ballot, 87% of Latinos in Colorado voted for Obama. That's approaching levels of support for the Democratic candidate that we historically see among African Americans. So while there is some diversity, and there are certainly places where Latino Republicans can be found, especially in Texas and Florida, generally speaking, in most of the country, Latinos will be Democrats for policy reasons as well as for political reasons. The bigger problem, as you identified, is a question of participation. How many Latinos participate? We know that in many parts of the country, there are many millions of Latinos eligible to vote. In Florida, for instance, as of 2017, an estimated 2.7 million Latinos were citizens of voting age and eligible to vote. That's about 18.6% of the Florida electorate. That's a significant chunk of voters. But turnout among those voters tends to be lower than it is for either white or African American voters. You have similar numbers in Texas, where the Latino population makes up almost 30% of the electorate. Even here in Rhode Island, the Latino population is about 10% of the active electorate. A recent study from Latino Decisions, which is the premier polling firm in the country working with Latinos, found that 2 months before the elections, this poll was completed in early September, just 2 months before the election, 60% of Latino voters reported that they had not been contacted by any campaign, political party, or political organization asking them to either register or vote. 60% of these millions of Latino voters have not been contacted by any candidate to try to convince them to vote or even to register. So when we talk about Latino participation, as with immigration, there's both a push and a pull factor. There may be reasons for Latinos to voluntarily register to vote and engage in politics, but we also know from political participation research that the most important factor determining whether people will vote or not, even whether they will register, is whether they've been asked to register and vote. Exactly. So to the extent that both the Democratic and Republican parties have not yet made outreach to Latino voters a major priority, we will continue to see relatively low levels of participation by Latinos. It's also true, though, that in many of the most important states, and you mentioned some of the elections this year, although the Latino electorate is smaller in most cases than the black or the white electorate, and participation rates tend to be low, those states also are very narrowly balanced in terms of partisanship, so that a place like Florida, in both the gubernatorial race this year and the Senate race, the potential margin of victory is less than 5 percentage points. So Latino voters are strategically located in some of the most important political constituencies in the country, and as they grow increasingly engaged in politics, are having a dramatic impact on the outcome of these elections.
I know some time ago, I think back in the days of the George W. Bush presidency, there was a lot of talk among Republicans of somehow appealing to Latino voters. But from what you say, it sounds like that this supposed effort by Republicans to try to appeal to Latinos really never really materialized.
Well, the report that the Republican National Committee commissioned after the 2012 election to try to figure out what went wrong with respect to their national prospects argued for a number of changes in Republican Party positioning, and in particular, emphatically advocated an outreach to African American and especially Latino voters. because Latino voters, partly because of the larger complement of Cuban-American Republicans that have always been part of the Latino electorate, and partly because Latino voters, not having been engaged as much as other groups, were thought to be more reachable by Republicans. The Republican National Committee, I believe they called it an autopsy report, suggested that the party make significant outreach to Latinos. And there are people in the Republican Party who wanted to do that, but then along came Donald Trump and the emergence of a presidential campaign in 2016 that really revolved around some very vicious and off-putting rhetoric about immigrants in general, but Latino immigrants in particular. So although there were voices within the Republican Party advocating more effective outreach to Latinos, it never happened. Part of the reason it never happened is because Latinos, as I said earlier, tend to be working class. They tend to be democratic. They tend to be concerned about issues that are much more prominent in the Democratic Party platform than for Republicans, such as healthcare, Social Security, employment, education, minimum wage, and so on. The only way to reach out to a population like that would be to offer policy concessions, which the Republican Party was simply not willing to make. It's not enough to say a few words in Spanish or attend Latino community events and festivals and so on. At a certain point, Latino voters, like all voters, demand policy commitments, and the Republican Party was simply not willing to make those commitments. Latino voters are sometimes thought to be more conservative than other voters, and the Republican Party has periodically tried to appeal to Latinos on the basis of positions opposing abortion or opposing same-sex marriage, promoting entrepreneurial business, and so on. The reality is that while Latinos do express much more conservative views on some social issues like abortion, same-sex marriage in particular, those issues are not very important to Latino voters. So the issues on which Latinos seem to have something in common with Republicans are not very important issues. The issues which are important to Latino voters, education, income, healthcare, and so on, tend to be issues where the Republican Party is hostile to the policy preferences of Latinos. So in a way, it's a no-win situation for the Republicans. On the one hand, they have a leader of the party who is openly and quite stridently anti-Latino, and they also have a policy profile which is not very attractive to Latino voters.
But you also seem to suggest that the Democratic Party has not been as effective in mobilizing Latinos as it might be. Do you see any signs of that changing? Is there, and I guess we need to bring this up to the upcoming midterms. Is there signs that the Democrats are focusing on Latino voters to any great degree in this upcoming election?
The Democratic Party is doing more than they have done in the past, and the continued growth of the Latino population means that the Democratic Party has lots of incentives to reach out more effectively. But there's still a long way to go.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the key senatorial and gubernatorial races across the country and where you think Latino voters will have a special impact. We mentioned Florida and Texas, but what other places might we look at for some important impacts of Latinos?
Well, Nevada and Arizona stand out, but before we move away from Florida and Texas, it's worth taking a look at what's happening in those two states.
Yeah, certainly.
In Florida, there are two very high-profile critical races this year. One of those is the Senate race where incumbent Bill Nelson is in the fight of his life against former Governor Scott. But in that race, although the most recent polls are showing Nelson up just a little bit, 2.4 points up in the Real Clear Politics average. Among Latinos, Nelson is extending his lead over Scott. The latest polls are 61% for Nelson, 39% for Scott. And that was an increase of almost 10 percentage points over the prior month and a half. So whatever's happening in Florida over the last few weeks, it's moving in Senator Nelson's direction. In the gubernatorial race in Florida, the situation is similar. Ron DeSantis, who was the surprise winner of the Republican nomination for governor, is running against Andrew Gillum, the mayor of Tallahassee, the Democrat. Gillum is the first African-American nominee for statewide office in Florida. He's been endorsed by Alianza, which is the organization representing Latinos in Central Florida, primarily Puerto Rican Latinos. And at this point, Gillum is significantly ahead among Latinos in Florida, even though it's a closer race statewide. Most recently, on October 1st, Governor Ricardo Rossello, who is the governor of Puerto Rico, endorsed both Gillum, the Democratic candidate for governor, and Nelson, the incumbent Democratic candidate for Senate. Since that endorsement, the numbers among Latinos for both Nelson and Gillum have improved, partly because although Scott has been very visible in Puerto Rico, so has Nelson, and the close identification that Florida Latinos have, the impression they have that former Governor Scott, Florida Governor Scott, and Donald Trump are very close, means that Scott is, in essence, being tied to Trump and all of the things that Trump has done or not done relative to Latinos.
Tony, in that regard, what was the impact of the hurricane in Puerto Rico? I know a lot of refugees from Puerto Rico went to Florida. Many are still in the state, I believe, and of course are technically eligible to vote as citizens of the United States.
Oh yes,
so the way that the Trump administration handled the hurricane, is that going to be a factor in the Florida races?
Oh yes, it's going to be a big factor. In addition to the current governor's endorsement, Gillum and Nelson have also been endorsed by Pedro Rossello, Ricardo's father, who is a former Governor Garcia Padilla, and the mayors of both San Juan and Ponce, the two largest cities in Puerto Rico. And all of those people in their endorsement statements about Gillum talked about the neglect that people in Puerto Rico felt coming from the Trump administration. So the Trump administration failed to satisfy people in Puerto Rico, many of whom did have to move to Florida to escape the poor housing and environmental and economic conditions after the hurricane. In fact, there may be as many as 50,000 Puerto Ricans who've moved from the island to Central Florida, now, which means that the Puerto Ricans now make up almost 500,000 voters in Florida. There are 2.6 million Latinos overall, 9.1 million other voters, white non-Hispanic voters. So Puerto Ricans make up about 20% of all of the Latino voters in Florida.
How does that compare to the Cuban American community?
The Cuban American population is still larger than the Puerto Rican population and still predominantly Republican. But among younger Cuban Americans, many of whom have never lived in Cuba, the population is moving increasingly towards Democrats for the same reason that other Latinos have moved there. Most of the high-profile Cuban American politicians in Florida now, especially the young ones, are Democrats. Marco Rubio is the highest profile Cuban American politician who is still in the Republican Party. But if you go down the ranks to the county government and municipal government, Miami-Dade County, most of the up-and-coming Cuban American politicians, especially in Southeast Florida, are actually Democrats. There are about 75,000 new Latino registrants in Florida in just the last month, and about 60% of them are in fact Puerto Rican. So you have two things happening in Florida with respect to Latinos, which is leading to that 61-39 split in favor of the Democrat. One of those is that the Cuban American population, which was reliably Republican, is aging out of the electorate. Younger Cuban Americans are leaning towards Democrats. And you also have the explosive growth of the Puerto Rican population, not just in the last several months or last year, but going back 10 years or more, so that the population of Central Florida around Orlando, the Kissimmee Valley, the Latinos there are overwhelmingly Puerto Rican. They're overwhelmingly Democratic. In Texas, you have a slightly different situation. In Texas, you also have a couple of high-profile races. You have a very tight Senate race between incumbent Ted Cruz, and Beto O'Rourke, who is Latino Mexican-American. You also have in the gubernatorial race, incumbent Governor Abbott. He's being challenged by Lupe Valdez, a woman from Dallas. She is the only Latina sheriff. She's no longer sheriff, but she was elected sheriff of Dallas County. She was the only Latina sheriff in the country, and she was one of the highest-ranking LGBTQ elected officials in the country as well. She is trailing Abbott by about 20 percentage points, although she does have strong support among Latinos. In the Senate race between Beto O'Rourke and Ted Cruz, most observers rate that as a toss-up. One of the reasons it's a toss-up is that Beto has very effectively mobilized the Mexican-American population in South Texas.
And he speaks Spanish fluently, right? And Cruz does not.
That's correct. That's correct. And as with other voters, as I said earlier, Latinos are more concerned about policy stances than they are about ethnicity. There was a time when a Latino candidate for office was quite rare, and during those years, those early candidates could count on strong support from Latinos without much attention to policy positions or even party. That's why there's so many Republican Latino elected officials in a place like Texas, some in California, some in Florida, is because many of them were elected to office at a time when Latino candidates were difficult to find, and Latino voters were willing to give them support. As the Latino electorate has matured over the last 2 or 3 decades, Latino voters have become a lot more selective in their preferences, and we have strong evidence that even when a Latino candidate is on the ballot, in most cases as a Republican, Latino voters will vote for a non-Latino Democrat based on policy position, not on ethnicity. So Latino voters have become, over the last several decades, very strategic in their voting and insistent that candidates who want their support need to earn it by appealing to Latino interests in education, housing, healthcare, environment, and so on.
Tony, usually when we think about Latino impact at the state level, we think about states like Texas or Arizona or California or Florida, but certainly the Latino population is present all across the country and in many other states. What about a state like Georgia or Alabama, where there are growing numbers of Latino voters? Are Latino voters likely to have some impact in those states?
They will have an impact. The gubernatorial election in Georgia, pitting Stacey Abrams, in which Stacey Abrams is a Democratic candidate, the first African-American woman ever nominated by one of the 2 major parties in Georgia, is reaching out to a certain extent to the Latino population in Georgia. Again, it's partly on the basis of partisanship because most Georgia Latinos are Democrats, but it's also on the basis of policies. She has had a strong progressive stance throughout her political career, and Latinos tend to be overwhelmingly liberal and or even progressive in their policy positions. Young Latinos in particular, the Latinos under the age of 35, are the single most progressive identifiable voting bloc in the United States. More progressive on questions of economic fairness, healthcare, environment, same-sex marriage, and so on, than virtually any other group that you can identify. So to the extent that people like Stacey Abrams in a place like Georgia reach out to those young Latinos on the basis of partisanship as well as policy, she will do quite well. But as the Latino Decision study from a couple of months ago shows, it won't happen automatically. The candidates who want Latino votes really need to work to get them. Between 2000 and 2010, the fastest growing Latino populations in the country were all in the Deep South. The fastest growing Latino population was in South Carolina, of all places. So between 2000 and 2010, the Latino population grew in all 50 states. Mm-hmm. There was not a single place in the country where Latino population didn't increase in those 10 years. The population increase has slowed a bit, but it's still growing quite rapidly. And South Carolina, Georgia, Florida are places where Latino voters will be increasingly significant. Even here in Rhode Island, where the citizen voting age population is just shy of 800,000 people, Latinos are about 75,000, that is citizen voting age Latinos. That's about 9.5% of the total, compared to 5% African American. So already in Rhode Island, the Latino electorate is potentially almost twice the size of the African American electorate. And what we know about Latinos, again, is that when Latinos register to vote, once they become registered, they are just as likely to vote as any other group. Mm-hmm. The problem is getting to that point of registration and all of the hurdles that any individual, but in particular Latinos, need to go through. So in states outside the traditionally Hispanic-oriented states, Texas, Florida, Illinois, New York, the 5 largest states in the country are also the states that have the largest Latino populations. But outside those states, the same rules apply. Appeal to Latinos on the basis of policies as well as partisanship, and actually reach out to Latinos to encourage them to register and to vote.
Well, Tony, it's certainly clear that the Latino population is going to be more and more significant in the future. Just to wind up our discussion here today, in terms of the election coming up in a few weeks, are there particular Latino candidates that have sort of emerged that we should watch in the future, who might become prominent or in future races?
Well, Beto O'Rourke, certainly in Texas, is likely to be an important figure on the national stage, whether he wins or not. Lupe Valdez, also in Texas. Hundreds of Latino candidates in California working their way up through the political system, from the local level to state level to statewide. You mentioned a couple in New York. Julia Salazar, I believe.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Julia Salazar. Right?
Yeah, they're definitely people to watch. There are thousands of Latino candidates running for elective office all over the country in every election. The media does not give as much attention to those candidates as they might until they reach the level of a Beto O'Rourke or a Lupe Valdez. But I believe that as time goes on, the media and the political parties, especially the Democratic Party, will be paying much more attention to these successful and charismatic Latino candidates who've been running for office all up and down the political structure.
Well, thanks so much, Tony. You've certainly enlightened us about the role that Latinos play in American politics. Any final thoughts about the upcoming election of Latinos that you want to leave us with?
No, like everybody else, I'm waiting to see what happens. Right now, the generic ballot is averaging about 13 points in favor of the Democratic Party. That's Real Clear Politics average of all of the generic ballot polls that have been done over the last several months. That suggests more than a blue wave. That suggests a blue tsunami. If the Democratic Party performs as well on Election Day as those generic ballot polls suggest, then they could pick up between 40 and 60 seats in the House of Representatives. That will bring many Latinos into positions of leadership in the U.S. Congress. Latinos who are already serving as senior minority party members of committees and subcommittees will find themselves in a position not only to devise policy and recommend policy to the Congress, but perhaps more importantly, given the fact that the Senate may still remain in the hands of the Republicans, as will the White House, and apparently the Supreme Court as well, those positions of leadership will put them in a position to conduct investigations, to subpoena witnesses, to subpoena documents, and to find out as much as they can during their years in leadership about how we got where we are today. So whether or not the election brings the Democratic Party to power in the U.S. House of Representatives will determine whether or not many of those high-profile Latino elected officials can really flex their muscles and exercise both the policy and political power that leadership seats in the Congress can bring.
Well, thanks so much, Professor Tony Affigne, for telling us about Latinos in American politics. I want to thank again Chris Judge of the Office of Marketing and Communications at Providence College for providing technical support, and Associate Vice President Joe Carr of Marketing and Communications for supporting this podcast. And thanks especially to our listeners of Beyond Your News feed. Please subscribe if you haven't yet subscribed, and please tell your friends about this new podcast. We look forward to being with you in a few weeks for at least one more podcast about the midterm elections coming up on November 6th. And register to vote if you have not yet done so.
Thanks to Dr. Hudson, Dr. Affigne, and the Providence College Political Science Department for this episode of Beyond Your Newsfeed. That podcast and the Providence College podcast are both available in iTunes and all the other usual places. For our producer, Chris Judge, I'm Joe Carr. Until next time.